Loom discovered something even more shocking. It seemed Sister Grace and Sister Agatha had been running the school since it opened in 1944, which was impossible because the current year was 2019, and that would mean that the sisters have been running the school for almost 80 years. What really confused Loom was that Sister Grace and Sister Agatha looked exactly the same as they did in 1944. It had been 1 week since Loom promised the ghost that she would help find her daughter, and Loom had still not made any progress. She had spoken to everyone who was at the school 2 years ago when Siru went missing, and they all said the same thing, that they had seen Siru that morning, and then she was just gone. Loom was so worried that she could not eat or sleep. It was all she could think about. What would the ghost do to her if she failed to find her daughter? The ghost had stopped haunting their dormitory as promised, and everyone was sleeping peacefully now, except Loom. There was so much weighing on her tiny shoulders. One afternoon, Loom was sitting in the lawn with her 2 friends, Nai and Fram. They asked Loom worriedly what they were going to do. They too were having nightmares, and they had been asking Loom the same question every day since that night with the ghost. Loom opened her mouth to tell them for the number 100th time that she did not have the answers, but she stopped when she saw one of their seniors approaching. Loom started to feel uncomfortable immediately she saw the senior. She had noticed this particular senior watching her for the past 1 week. Everywhere Loom turned, the senior was there, her eyes following Loom with this look on her face that made the hair on the back of Loom's neck stand up. Loom could not explain it, but the senior made her feel one type of way. The senior's name was Senior Sinchang, and she had very strange behavior. In fact, her behavior was so strange that everyone at the school stayed away from her. The senior was always staring into space and talking to people who were not there. And if you went outside at night, you would find her wandering the school campus alone. Loom took a step back when the senior stopped in front of her. That day, the senior spoke to Loom, which was surprising because she never spoke to anyone. She came close and stood by Loom, and then told Loom in an urgent voice that there was a very good reason why people slept with their doors locked, and that there were things that should never be allowed to enter the house. And then she turned around and walked away, leaving Loom and her friends to stand there and wonder what she meant. Her words made no sense to them, but they were very scary. And that night, Loom had bad dreams where the senior was chasing her through the forest behind the school. Guys, before I continue this story, I want to tell you a little bit about this school and the Reverend sisters who ran it. It is important to the story. You will see why as I go. Like I mentioned in part 1, the school was called the St. Martha's Boarding School for Girls, and it was a prestigious Catholic school in a town called Bamenda. Only rich people's children went there because the school fee was too expensive, and the principal was a reverend sister called Sister Grace. Sister Grace was in her 50s, and she had an assistant called Sister Agatha, same age. The 2 reverend sisters were very close, and they ran the school like a military camp. They lived in a convent next to the school, but the students complained that it felt as if the sisters never left the school campus. It was as if they lived on campus with the girls, and this was because everywhere the girls turned, it did not matter what hour of the day it was. Whether it was at night or during the day, the 2 reverend sisters were always there, watching them sternly from a distance, ready to discipline them for the slightest mistake. Some girls even joked that you could summon the reverend sisters just by thinking about them. Okay, back to the story now. A day after the encounter with a strange senior, Lum was on her way back from morning mass with the other students. The students usually walked in a single line to and from mass, and no student was allowed to leave the line. If you did, you would receive a caning and then dry clean all the classrooms in the school. It was the worst punishment at the school, and the students did everything to avoid it. But that morning, Lum did not care about being punished. She needed to talk to her father urgently, and it could not wait. She was running out of time. Usually, Lum met her father on Sundays after Mass. That was their arrangement, and that day was only Thursday, but she needed answers about the ghost, and her father was the only one she knew who could help. The spirit world was his area of expertise. Lum quietly left the line and ran to the priest rest house where she knew her father would be. Her heart was beating fast with anticipation. But when she arrived at her father's office in the back of the compound, Lum was met not by her father but another priest who told Lum, to her disappointment, that her father had left the parish on an emergency trip the night before. He had no idea when Father Thomas will be back. That was her father's name. Lum was so sad on hearing this. How come every time she needed her father, he was never there? And then he would show up when he felt like it with many gifts, hugs and apologies for her. She snuck back into the school campus, and luckily the Reverend sisters did not catch her. As Lum was walking back to the dormitory that day, she saw that strange senior following her again. The senior's eyes were like two laser beams pointing at Lum from a distance, and it made her shiver. And to be honest, Lum was getting tired of the senior's looks, so she decided to put an end to it that day. She turned around and walked back toward the senior. It was a big crime at the school for a junior student to speak rudely to a senior student, but Lum was not having it that day. She stopped in front of the senior and demanded to know why the senior was always following her and what she wanted. But her words and her bad mood did not seem to affect the senior. Senior Sinchang simply stood there, not reacting or saying a word, and observed Lum in that strange way of hers. This made Lum even more frustrated. She threw her hands in the air and was about to turn around and leave when the senior said something to her. The senior told Lum, to Lum's shock, that a girl goes missing from the school every year on November 30th at exactly 2 p.m. She said that it had been happening since the school was built in 1944. That the missing girls were all aged 16 and that they were all light-skinned. She said that Siru's disappearance confused her because Siru was the first girl to ever go missing from the school, who was only 12 years old and not light-skinned. And she did not go missing on the same day as the others. November 30th was a few weeks away, and the senior concluded her story by saying that she wondered who would go missing this year. Lum did not realize that she had moved close and was listening intensely to the senior. The things that were coming out of the senior's mouth were shocking and scary, and a part of Lum wanted to conclude that the senior was lying. But Lum just knew that she was not. It was the way the senior spoke, the way she said it, that made Lum believe her instantly. She asked the senior why she had not said anything sooner, and the senior simply said that Lum had not asked. Lum then asked why no one was investigating the missing girls, and how come the school was not shut down with such a high record of missing girls, and the senior gave her the strangest answer. She told Lum that it was as if the girls were forgotten the moment they went missing. No one ever came looking for them, almost as if all memories of them had been erased. Siru was the exception. She was the first girl whose parents came looking for her. Lum was silent for a moment, trying to make sense of everything. She asked the senior how she knew all these things. The senior was only 4 years older than Lum. How come she was so informed about these kinds of things? The senior answered that she saw things, and that she kept what she saw to herself because no one believed her. Everyone thought she was crazy, even her own parents. Her voice became even more serious after that, and she gave Lum a warning. She told Lum that Lum was in serious trouble if she did not find Suru before the 2 weeks were over. That the ghost would come back, and this time there would be no reasoning with the ghost. She said she had seen Lum talking to the ghost in her dream and said Lum should never have done such a thing in the first place without guidance. Unfortunately, she could not help Lum because she did not know where Suru was or whether Suru was dead or alive. She asked Lum to follow her, that she wanted to show Lum something, and Lum followed. Lum was still scared of the senior, especially after hearing everything, but she was hungry for more answers. The senior took Lum to the school library. It was a large room with books and books everywhere. There, the senior took Lum to a section where the school albums were kept and showed Lum a shelf full of albums, old and new. She told Lum that she could find photos of every girl who ever attended the school there. She opened one of the new albums first and showed Lum a photo of Suru, smiling happily at the camera. Suru was so tiny and innocent and cute in the photo that it made Lum smile sadly, wondering where she was, what had happened to her, and thought Suru deserved to be at home with her loving parents. In the photo, Suru was sitting between Sister Grace and Sister Agatha in what seemed to be the bench in the schoolyard, and both women had their hands placed protectively on Suru's shoulder. It seemed like an ordinary photo. The senior opened one of the old albums next and showed Lum a picture of another girl and said that this was the girl who went missing the year before Suru. And just like the senior had mentioned before, the girl in the photo was light-skinned and she seemed to be around 16 years old. In the photo, much like Suru, the girl was sitting between Sister Grace and Sister Agatha on the bench in the schoolyard, smiling brightly at the camera. Senior Sinchang turned the pages of the album and showed Suru more pictures of missing girls, and the more Suru looked at the pictures, the more she started to realize something. In all the photos, the missing girls were all seated between Sister Grace and Sister Agatha and on the same bench in the schoolyard, and the sisters had their hands placed protectively on each girl's shoulder. The way they were sitting and looking at the camera was the same in all the photos too, almost as if it had been rehearsed, as if each year the photographer or the ones being photographed tried to recreate the photo from the year before. The most disturbing thing Lum noticed was that the photos were all taken on November 30th, except in Suru's case, which was taken on May 7th. What was even more disturbing was that Sister Grace and Sister Agatha did not show up in any of the other photos in the album, only the photos with the missing girls. Lum did not understand what she was looking at, but she knew it was bad. Lum was so lost in examining the albums back and forth that when she looked up, she realized that the senior had left and that it was dark outside. And from the way the school campus was quiet, it seemed everyone had gone to bed. Lum thought about going back to the dormitory and returning the next day to continue her investigation, but something told her to keep going. Turning her attention back to the albums, Lum discovered something even more shocking. According to what she was seeing in the photos in front of her, and according to what the school records said, it seemed Sister Grace and Sister Agatha had been running the school since it opened in 1944, which was impossible because the current year was 2019, and that would mean that the sisters have been running the school for almost 80 years. No one lived that long, especially seeing as the two sisters were already in their 50s in 1944. What really confused Lum was that Sister Grace and Sister Agatha looked exactly the same as they did in 1944. They had not aged a day in almost 80 years. Just as Lum came to the conclusion that Sister Grace and Sister Agatha may not be who they claim to be, she heard a strange noise outside. And when she looked up, she saw something that made her jump back with a scream, throwing the album in her hand away. She saw by the door, half hidden in the darkness, Sister Grace and Sister Agatha just standing there, looking at her, not saying anything, and with these eyes that seemed not human. Lum blinked for a second, and the sisters were gone. She rubbed her eyes to make sure, but there was no one there, almost as if she had imagined it. She stood up very quickly and ran to the dormitory, fear following her in the wind. That night, Lum could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt as if Sister Grace and Sister Agatha were standing by her bed. And when she opened her eyes to check, no one was there. Every time she tried to fall asleep, she felt as if someone was standing in the dark corners of the dormitory, watching her. And when she checked, she swore she saw someone standing there in the dark. But when she blinked and rubbed her eyes, they were gone. Lum got up and ran to her friend's bed. She was afraid to sleep in her own bed. The next day, Lum took her friends to the library to show them what she had found. And to her shock, the albums were all gone. Not just that, every single piece of evidence she had found against Sister Grace and Sister Agatha were all gone. The shelves were now lined with textbooks instead of albums. Confused, Lum ran around the library searching and thinking maybe she forgot where the albums were kept. But there was no trace of the albums anywhere. It was as if they never even existed. Lum could see the doubt on her friends' faces, and she tried desperately to explain to them that she was not making it up. She hoped they believed her. Lum became obsessed with Sister Grace and Sister Agatha after that. She found herself thinking of them constantly, secretly watching them, wondering who they really were, or rather what they were, how they managed not to age in almost 80 years, and how no one seemed to notice that there was something off about them. It was not normal. Lum really wished she could talk to her father. He would know more, but he was still not back from his trip. Time went by very quickly after that, and before Lum knew it, the 2 weeks she had promised the ghost were over. On the day she was supposed to tell the ghost where her daughter was, Lum panicked. She walked up and down the dormitory staring at the clock, wishing that she could stop time, but the clock kept rushing forward. It felt as if she could not breathe as night drew closer. Late in the afternoon, she went to see Senior Sinchang, hoping that the senior would help her somehow. But when the senior saw Lum, she acted as if she did not know Lum. She looked right through Lum when Lum approached and said that she did not know what Lum was talking about, and then left. Lum carried her hands on her head and watched the senior leave. She did not know what to do. Night was approaching and she knew the ghost would come that night. She wandered the school campus for hours and hours, afraid to go back to the dormitory, remembering Senior Sinchang's words that there would be no reasoning with the ghost this time. Lum had no idea what to say to the ghost. When she finally found the courage to return to the dormitory, it was almost midnight. Lum sat on her bed and waited because she could not fall asleep even if she tried. At midnight on the dot, she heard the ghost enter the dormitory. The sound of her red blood high heels going crush, 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 slowly up to her bed. Lum closed her eyes tightly and waited. "Where is my daughter?" she heard the ghost whisper close to her ear. The supernatural sound of the ghost's voice making Lum shiver inside. Lum forced one of her eyes open and jumped back in fear. The ghost face was right in front of her face, showing anticipation. Lum did not answer the ghost immediately, choosing her words very carefully. And the moment she opened her mouth and told the ghost that she was sorry that she had not found her daughter, two things happened all at once. The ghost face changed from anticipation to something that Lum could not explain in human words, but it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. The ghost screamed, and the scream was so angry and powerful that the force of it lifted Lum off the ground and threw her across the room. She landed on her back and hit her head on a cupboard. I know some of you are wondering where Manka'a the ghost has been all this time. Well, according to my own imagination, I'm thinking she went back to her grave or the spirit world and waited there patiently. She trusted Lum to find her daughter, so she waited patiently, counting the seconds until she could see her precious daughter again. And while she was waiting, she dreamt of her daughter every day. She wondered if her daughter had eaten that day, if her daughter was happy, if she had warm clothes on, if the people she now lived with were treating her kindly, if she still sang her sweet little songs because she loved to sing. When the day finally came, Manka'a came out of the darkness filled with hope, eager to be with her daughter again, only for her to come here today and hear this stupid, lying girl called Lum say that her patience and hope had been for nothing. Her daughter was still missing and Lum was a liar. She had trusted Lum with her whole dead heart, and all this time Lum had been lying to her. Manka'a was so angry. Lum was going to pay. She was going to make Lum pay. Her anger was so strong. The ghost scream woke up everyone in the dormitory, and the girls woke up to find their dormitory shaking and things falling off the walls. They screamed and ran to the door and tried to run out of the dormitory, but the ghost banged the door in their faces, locking everyone in. The room was filled with chaos and girls screaming. The ghost flew around the dormitory like a plastic paper bag in the wind, screaming, "Liar, liar, liar, liar," over and over again. She was looking for Lum, who was now hiding under a bed. She lifted things and threw them down, scratched the walls, pushed the beds around looking for Lum. When she finally found Lum, she laughed in a demonic way and dragged Lum out from under the bed where she was hiding and lifted her long fingers, intending to end Lum. Lum closed her eyes and waited for the worst to happen, crying silently. She wanted to run to fight, but she could not. Her back was hurting so much from the fall. But before the ghost could do her any harm, the door suddenly burst open, scaring the ghost away. Lum looked up and saw Sister Grace and Sister Agatha standing by the door. The students immediately ran to the Reverend Sisters, screaming and crying. They told the sisters what had happened and that they were too scared to stay in the dormitory. But the sisters sternly told them to stop imagining things and go back to sleep. As the sisters left, Lum swore she saw Sister Grace looking at her one funny way, but she was not sure. The next couple of days were hell for the girls in the St. Mary's dormitory. Manka'a the ghost did not wait for midnight anymore to visit them. She came as soon as it was dark outside, and she screamed and ran around the dormitory, throwing things around. All night long, the sound of her heels could be heard going up and down the dormitory. Crush, 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 crush. Slow at first, then fast, then slow, then fast, up and down, over and over again. There was no rest for the girls. At night, they prayed for day to come, and during the day, they prayed for night not to come. Lum suffered more than anyone else. She woke up every morning to find her school uniform and bag soaked in a bucket of water. And when she tried to fall asleep at night, the ghost would seize her pillow and blanket, or the ghost would lean close to her ear just as she was about to fall asleep and start singing nonsensical songs in her ear, keeping her up all night. It was hell for Lum. She tried everything to get through to the ghost, but the ghost was not in the mood to listen. Every time Lum opened her mouth to explain, the ghost started screaming non-stop. One day after school, Lum was on her way to the refectory when she saw Sister Grace and Sister Agatha walking into the small forest behind the school. Lum thought it was odd because no one ever went in there. The trees there were so large and close together that it made the area look permanently dark and haunted, which is why no one ever went there. Lum did not want to go in there. The place was too scary. But despite her fear, something told her to go after the sisters. And she did, following the sisters into the forest. Ever since she saw those photos, she was convinced that the sisters were up to something. Her blood went cold whenever she was in close proximity to the Reverend sisters or whenever they spoke to her. Being anywhere near them, her body behaved as if it was reacting to something bad. Inside the forest, the two Reverend sisters walked to the biggest, oldest tree in the forest and stopped there. Lum hid behind a tree nearby and watched, waiting for them to do something strange, something that would finally give her the answer she was looking for. But the two Reverend sisters just stood there doing nothing, not talking to each other, not moving. For 1 hour straight, they just stood there. But from the look of things, it seemed like they were waiting for something or someone. The way they were constantly looking up at the tree and then down at their watches. Lum was not sure. She waited for so long that her stomach started to grumble from hunger. And a part of her considered going back to the school to eat, but she knew she had to see this through. Just when she thought she could not stand waiting any longer, the two women simply stopped waiting, turned around, and started walking back towards the campus. Lum was not sure what had just happened. She wanted to follow the Reverend sisters back to the campus because it was the safe thing to do. But something told her to go to the tree. When she went to the tree and looked around, there was nothing special there. Just an old tree with an imposing presence. Lum was about to turn around and leave when she noticed something sticking out from under a bunch of fallen branches next to the tree. She went to check. There she found a red school bag and one single shoe carelessly hidden under the branches, as if the person had been in a rush. Lum picked up the items and went through the school bag, and what she found shocked her. She found books in the bag, and they all had the name Ngwasiri written on them. Lum stared at the things in her hand, her heart beating fast with hope. The bag belonged to the missing girl. But how? Siri had been missing for 2 years. How was it possible that her school bag was still intact? Especially seeing as it was left out here in the woods, not protected from the rain. Or maybe someone left it there recently. Lum took one last look around, holding the items tightly to her chest, and ran back to the school campus. That's it for part 2, guys. Please stay tuned for part 3 next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m, where we continue our search for the missing girl. We are getting closer. Who left the school bag and shoe under the tree? What were the Reverend sisters up to? Were they even Reverend sisters? Why do girls keep disappearing from the school? Why do they disappear in a particular manner? Who was taking them and why? And most importantly, please don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. I want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching.